want to.
Last night we were watching President Obama give his speech where he said that the United States was entering Libya and involving itself in those events in order to prevent a horrible stain on the consciousness of the world and of Americans, to prevent a disaster in the cities of Libya caused by Colonel Gaddafi, something that he at one point even compared to disasters that have happened in the past where there were millions of people killed, as happened in Rwanda. Now, what is your response to President Obama's speech?
Well, I think we need to understand that Obama, is launching a new war, under the rubric of saving lives, but he's opening up a new front in the U.S.'s war for greater empire. And we have two wars the United States is engaged in, the imperialist wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and now there's another war that's being launched, and there are the Tomahawk cruise missiles, that are being fired. There are bombs that are being dropped, and in Obama's speech last night, while he's rationalizing this intervention and legitimizing the horror that's going to be visited upon the Libyan people, not once did he use the word war. Not once. This is remarkable. But this is all part of the deceptiveness, because he wants this to sound like this clean, sanitary effort, to save lives and to prevent the bloodshed. But in fact, what the U.S. is trying to do here, and people need to understand this, what the U.S. is trying to do is to advance its economic, political, and military interests in the region, and what they're trying to do is to weaken the military capacity and resolve of the Gaddafi regime. They're trying to build up certain elements of the opposition, and ultimately they're trying to affect regime change. This is the purpose of it.
So you think he's lying when he says that they're not trying to do regime change? I mean, he denied that.
Yeah, well, they're trying to, through various means and machinations, to topple this regime, either through direct military action or through building up some forces. I mean, there's been defections, colonels and ministers to some of these, oppositional forces. But let's be clear. He uses this phrase, saving lives, but in Bahrain, which is a solid ally of the U.S. in the Middle East, so solid that it's the home base to the U.S. Naval Fifth Fleet. Here you have a government that's hated by the people, where you've seen incredible protests in the streets, where soldiers have gone into the hospitals, and threatened people, shot people.
We've been watching it. It was terrible.
We've seen all that, and
Yemen
medical
as well,
staff,
too,
and in Yemen too. But these regimes, since they're solid allies of the United States, and since the U.S. has these vital interests that are being protected by those regimes, is not calling out human rights violations, is only calling for dialogue, but it's not launching any kind of war there.
And as well, at the same time all of this broke out, there were these reports which have disappeared from the media of thousands of photographs of American soldiers involved in brutal operations and murders in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, have people, the very same day that Obama is giving this speech, the very same day, Rolling Stone is publishing, these grisly, gruesome photos, of the killings by this U.S. Army, kill squad in Afghanistan. I mean, people should not forget, the U.S. said it was going into Iraq for humanitarian reasons, to stop the tyranny of the tyrant Saddam Hussein. And what's happened? Hundreds of thousands of people have died as a consequence. 2 million people have been forced out of Iraq, external refugees. 2 million people displaced within the country. A city, Fallujah, where the U.S., this is a city of the 300,000 people. And what happened in Fallujah? The U.S. just decimated the place, and we have Abu Ghraib. These are the values, quote, values, and these are the interests that are actually being served by U.S. imperialism entry and intervention. This is what U.S. imperial intervention is all about. And the prettification and the honeyed phrase by Obama, must be seen for what it is, a deceptive cover for what is a brutal move to advance the interest of empire. Look, when King Leopold went into the Belgium went into from Belgium went into the Congo. He described what was happening there as a great mission, to save people from their own worst, vices and doings and comings. And that, of course, was a savage. I mean, millions of people died as a result of the Belgian conquest. America went into Vietnam, into China. 2 million people died, and that was under the banner of freedom. The colonialists, the British and the French, have always used these arguments. The French, who, by the way, I mean, your viewers know they were the ones who were first flying in there. The French, killed more than 1 million people when they took over Algeria, when they colonized Algeria, and the war for Algerian independence, the war for Algerian independence took the lives of 1 million people. This was in the late 50s and early 60s. So this is the standard trope of imperialism, that we're doing it for the benefit of people, for the advance of civilization.
When you're saying we're doing it for the benefit of the wealthy class in America, because I don't see it trickling down to the poor in America.
Yeah, well, the U.S. is the U.S.
What is the U.S. role in the world? I mean, we're supposed to be leading this coalition of the willing.
Yeah.
Are we? And then we back off from leading it, and now they're talking about a covert operation in order to fool the people in the United States into thinking that we're not really involving ourselves in another war. This is what I've been watching on Al Jazeera and other media all day. So what exactly are we fighting for? I mean, in that way.
Well, the U.S. had a string of neo-colonial regimes in the Middle East. I mean, Mubarak, of course, had been in power 30 years. He had been the second largest recipient of U.S. military and economic assistance, in the Third World, next to Israel. And Mubarak's regime was propped up by the United States. And, this was, a viciously repressive regime. I mean, there was, by one estimate, there was one police person for every 35 people in Egypt. There was a permanent state of emergency law. This was a regime that was, as I said, financed, armed, and backed by the United States.
Absolutely.
And there are other regimes, in Jordan. And then, of course, Israel is the main watchdog of U.S. imperial interest in the Middle East. Well, these regimes now, these pro-U.S. client regimes, are the object of mass hatred and uprising, throughout the Middle East.
It seems that way because every day it's another country added to the list.
And then Yemen, we have Yemen and Bahrain. I mean, let's look at the speech and the hypocrisy of what Obama is saying. Because he's saying he's going in to protect the lives and going in to protect the well-being of people in Libya. But in Bahrain, where the U.S. Naval Fifth Fleet is stationed, you had troops loyal to that regime that serves U.S. interests. As I said, it's the base for the U.S. Fifth Fleet. These troops were going into hospitals and shooting and threatening patients. That you had medical staff that was being threatened, people being killed on the streets by a regime that is, the handmaiden of U.S. interest in that part of the world. Well, that's not an object of U.S. concern and humanitarianism, because the U.S.'s interests reside in maintaining the stabilization of that regime. Right. But in Libya, which we can perhaps talk a little more about, it's a very different. It's a different situation, because in Libya, Gaddafi, had gone through some changes, some mutations, and the United States is going in there because they are trying to take advantage, of an uprising. Let's understand that this began, this uprising in Libya began as a just and righteous uprising against a very oppressive regime. But from the very beginning, there was a commingling of imperialist intrigue with this just uprising. But once the U.S. stepped in, and there was intrigue, as I said all along, once the U.S. stepped in, that changed fundamentally the character of what's going on. As I said, the U.S. is seeking to basically weaken the military capacity and resolve. What is the purpose? To weaken the military capacity and resolve of the Gaddafi regime, to aid, certain elements of the opposition which, are calling for U.S. and Western intervention, and ultimately to replace the Gaddafi regime with a more pliant pro-Western regime. Look, Libya has the largest reserves of oil in Africa. It has the 9th largest reserves of oil in the world. Much of Europe, Western Europe, depends on the oil from Libya. 25% of Italy's imported oil comes from Libya. there's a great power game that's being played out, and Gaddafi is being demonized to justify, the U.S. attempt to go in there and create a stable, as I said, pliant regime in the midst of a Middle East and North Africa that's in a state, as you said, of turmoil, and they want to effect regime change under the banner of humanitarian intervention.
Can we talk a little bit about the history of Libya? Because I don't think many of the viewers, and myself really included, really knows all that much about Colonel Gaddafi and how he got to be in charge and what kind of state he runs in Libya. What is the character of that state? And maybe you could enlighten us. How did he get into power and why? What does he stand for?
Yeah, good question, because one thing you don't learn about in the U.S. Press is history, actual history, and the dynamics of empire, the U.S. empire. Now, I've written articles. I do want to commend to people's attention several articles I've written.
Let's take a moment to talk. Actually, let's go into this whole history thing, but first, let's talk about one of the reasons you're here, because there's an event that's coming up you want to tell folks about.
Right.
So why don't you tell them right now about that event?
And then we'll come back to...
we'll come back to the history of Libya.
Well, I did want to invite your viewers to what's going to be a very exciting and thrilling event that's going to be taking place on Monday, April 11th at the Harlem Stage. Okay, and this is at 135th Street and Convent Avenue. This is at 7 o'clock. And this event is to mark the publication, on the occasion of the publication of Basics, this book from the talks and writings of Bob Avakian.
For folks. And who is Bob Avakian and why should we care?
Yeah, and Bob Avakian is a serious revolutionary and a wide-ranging thinker.
That's pretty intense.
Serious revolutionary and a wide-ranging thinker who's also the chairman of the Revolutionary Communist Party. Now, this book is from his talks and writings, and the book speaks, to very powerfully to questions of revolution, very powerfully to questions of revolution and human emancipation. And what's going to be happening at the Harlem Stage on April 11th at 7 p.m. This is 135th in Convent.
Right by City College.
Yeah, it's City College, right. What's going to be happening is there's going to be an incredible event, as I said. It's going to be an evening of music, visual arts, poetry, and readings. And some of the performers include jazz musicians David Murray and William Parker. The writer, poet Reggie Gaines, and Ruby Dee, who people know as the actress and also a writer. And it's going to be a very exciting evening, as I said. In the title of the event, as I said, on the occasion of the publication of Basics.
Right, the book that we were just looking at.
On the occasion and it's a celebration of revolution, a celebration of revolution and the vision of a new world. And this is something that doesn't come along often, this kind of event. So I really want to, encourage people to come out. The tickets are $35, but $15 for students and the unemployed.
And it's non-profit, of course.
Yeah, and as I said, it's going to be an exciting mix of culture and all sorts of things, and people need to be there, be part of this experience, and they can get tickets at the Harlem Stage or at Revolution Books, which is located at 146 West 26th Street between 6th and 7th Avenue. I just want to let that information get out.
It's not an average bookstore. This is not Brentano's or Barnes & Noble or Borders or anything like that. This is a pretty interesting bookstore that specializes in books about revolution and politics and history, and it's a fascinating bookstore.
It's great. It's where
it's not your average commercial.
Revolutionary ideas are intersecting with science and culture.
It's a community spot, really.
And every week, in any given week, there's all kinds of exciting programs happening there too. But Basics, this program is something that people should really.
Just give me 20 seconds. What is Basics about?
Okay, as I said, it speaks very powerfully to questions of revolution and human emancipation. Look, let me just, and Avakian, as I said, Bob Avakian is a serious revolutionary and a wide-ranging thinker
Sure.
who is
He's the leader of
chairman
this
the
organization that you're talking about.
The Revolutionary Communist
Yes,
Party.
you
He's the
write for
chairman
their
of that.
paper. You write
I write
for-
for their paper,
Yeah.
for the paper that is
Yeah.
the voice of the Revolutionary Communist
Sure.
Party, which is Revolution.
Right.
And by the way, my articles on the the situation in the
Sure.
Middle East, and Avakian's writings, on philosophy, on politics, on the crucial questions that we are confronting and trying to change the world. These are all found in Revolution, and it's revcom.us if people want to go to that
Okay.
website.
Tell folks again,
revcom.us, which is the website of Revolution newspaper. If people want to get timely analysis of what's going on in the world and come to understand how a movement for revolution is being built right here in the belly of the beast, and to become part of that movement, contribute to it, they need to read that newspaper. It's an extraordinary paper.
Okay, thank you. Raymond Lotta is here. He's a writer for Revolution newspaper, and we're talking about Libya, and we're going to now talk a little bit about the history of Libya and how Colonel Gaddafi got to be in power and what we think he stands for. Go ahead.
Right. Well, Libya, the northern coastal regions of Libya were colonized by the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, in the 1500s. And it was not the Libya that we know today. It wasn't a unified state.
Okay.
But as I said, portions of it were colonized by the Ottomans of the Ottoman Empire. And then, in the early 20th century, the Italians came into Libya, 1910, 1911. Now, the Italian imperialists were latecomers to the imperial banquet table. The British were already in control of Egypt. The French, whom I mentioned, had killed more than 1 million people in the Algerian War for Independence.
In Algeria.
Were in Algeria
Okay.
by the time the Italians, got into Libya. And from 1911 to 1943, the Italians were engaged in a savage campaign to, quote, pacify and colonize Libya. And by some estimates, some 500,000 Libyans died as a result of the killings,
A relatively small country as far
and
as
a relative,
population.
it's a huge yeah, as I said, this is the estimates.
Huge country,
of
small population.
Right, huge
Huge
land-wise,
percentage.
and as I said, by some estimates, 500,000 people died of hunger, of disease, and of the killings that took place over this period of 1911 to 1943. Now, the Italians were colonizing, as I said, and the Italians were on the losing end of World War II.
Oh,
and
they were?
the victors,
I think we heard that. Yeah, right.
the victors, the U.S. and Great Britain and France, right, then were moving in to carve up, that part of the world, and the U.S. was in the dominant position. So they installed this King Idris, and the U.S. also established.
Is he the king that they're waving the?
Some of
royal
those people,
flag?
right? King Idris came to power after World War II.
So the rebels, some of the rebels are.
Some of the rebels are monarchists, who not all. It's a very mixed brew. As I say, it's complex because there was a righteous uprising against Gaddafi, but this was commingled with imperialist intrigue. And among the opposition forces are people that are cravenly pro-imperialist, and then there are others who are fighting.
Now you're saying that's interesting that you would say that there are elements that there's a righteous reason to rebel against Gaddafi. Now, I thought that Gaddafi came to power as a popular figure.
He did. So this is why it's different than Mubarak in Egypt. It's a different set of factors. Gaddafi came to power in 1969. He was part of what was called a colonel's revolt, like Nasser in Egypt, and they overthrew the king. Idris, as I said, had hosted one of the largest U.S. overseas bases, the Wheelus Air Force Base, which was used for reconnaissance and missile testing. And Gaddafi came to power as part of a nationalist upsurge in that part of the world. Now, Gaddafi, condemned Idris's, collaboration with the West, and also called for greater national sovereignty. And at that time, what revenues existed in the oil sector, because oil was only discovered in 1959 in Libya, but those revenues were being parlayed into the hands of a very privileged elite. They were leaving the country, and Gaddafi, was the embodiment of this nationalist upsurge, and he was calling out, the collaboration of this king and the injustice and poverty in this society.
Right.
But here's the thing about Gaddafi. He spoke a very militant talk, But Gaddafi never fundamentally broke with the imperialist system. You know, there were semi-nationalizations of the oil sector, but he never broke with imperialism, and he was always wheeling and dealing with imperialism.
Now, can the argument be made that, I've seen this in a lot of these countries, they don't have the expertise to get the oil out of the ground, that they need the Western oil companies to come and to drill the oil in order to sell it. And therefore, that's often the excuse in many countries that have had revolutions, that they still have to keep the Western powers in contact with them.
Right. This is the outlook of forces like Gaddafi. In other words, their beef, their gripe, was that imperialism was taking too much of the oil revenue, was not investing as widely as it should, and that the Libyan state should have control over these revenues in order to enact a certain project of development. But that project of development was always dependent on the integration of Libya into the imperialist world economy and oil. What you're talking about oil is very true. There was this idea that the lifeblood of Libya would be oil. So King Idris was developing, you know, the oil fields. Gaddafi continued to do it, and his notion was that we're going to use these revenues for the benefit of the people. But he was actually creating a state capitalist system with some welfare, welfareism in terms of raising living standards, of some improvements in housing and health.
Hospitals, roads.
Some
you can see the nice roads that
there was
there was
this construction, but it was
unusual.
But it was all premised on Libya being this oil exporter, and the masses of people were essentially powerless.
What's wrong with that?
Because a number of things. One, agriculture was distorted. You know, the base of any society must be agriculture, and in any underdeveloped country in particular, if you're serious about revolutionary transformation, you have to empower people to break with this whole network and entanglement of imperialist relations of domination, and you have to create a self-reliant economy. You have to feed people. You have to develop agriculture. You have to diversify, and you can't do that if everything is geared towards oil. And this is what it was, in terms
towards
of
export, continuing the
exports
same, export economy, whether it's sugar in Cuba or
these monocultures in terms of particular agricultural crops.
I've seen so many countries that have had revolutions that overthrew some, the Batistas of the world or the King Idris of the world, and yet replace it with just trying to sell the same product to the same people.
Right. This is the outlook of radicalized sections.
Just keeping the money.
Yeah, it's the outlook of radicalized sections of the upper middle classes and the bourgeois, the aspiring bourgeois classes. Their beef, as I said, was that they wanted to control the revenues, not that you need to get beyond the horizon of exploitation. Let me just say that a genuine socialist revolution, a genuine communist-led revolution, is going to affect two ruptures. One with the world imperialist system, the domination and the dependency and the military control.
The big countries, Europe, United
dominating,
States.
And
I guess Russia and China these days.
They're aspiring powers and distorting these societies. But you need to break with that and develop, as I said, a balanced economy. But you also have another break, and that is with the old ways, the old relations, patriarchy, the oppressive relations.
Wasn't there some breaks with that? Because in Libya, you do have, women seem to be at a higher level inside the government than in the other countries. I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, they touted that.
As I said, this was all within the confines of the world imperialist system, and within the confines of the framework of old tribal divisions in that society and existing patriarchal relations. There were some improvements in terms of opportunities for women, but under Gaddafi, Sharia, repressive religious law was still the foundation of social codes. So there was no, as I said, when we're talking about a revolution, these were societies that, like in Egypt under Nasser, or what we're talking about here with Gaddafi, or something like a Chavez today. These societies, have not, as I said, broken out of the grip of the world market, nor is there anything genuinely emancipating in what has happened in terms of social change and transformation.
All right, so we have a few minutes left. What's happening now, and how does that relate to the history? Was there a point when Gaddafi went from, at least a man of the people to an enemy of the people? Is he an enemy of the people? And if so, why shouldn't he be unseated?
Well, Okay, one, in the as I said, this went through changes with Gaddafi. He became this populist nationalist in the ways that I described. He had some support, social support within Libyan society, and he took, these militant posturing was a lot of his trademark, and he was a thorn in the side of imperialism for a period of time. A thorn in the side at the same time that he was wheeling and dealing, and he could be a thorn in the side.
How is he a thorn? What was?
Well, I mean, he was giving some support to movements in other parts of Africa, for instance,
that were against U.S. interests.
That were against U.S. interests, and he was being backed by a rising, imperial power in the 60s and 70s, which was the Soviet Union, which was socialist in name, but not genuinely socialist, and it had its imperial agenda, and it was backing people like Gaddafi, and this is what annoyed the Western imperialists, that he was doing things that were undermining some of their interests. Even as I said, that he was prepared to barter.
Well,
and
Reagan
negotiate.
Actually bombed. This isn't the first time the U.S. has been there. They bombed him last time.
No, people should understand
because he said the Gulf of Sidra, which is within, seems to be within their territory, is not within their territory. The U.S. said they had a right to go right up to their coastline with warships anytime they felt like.
In the 80s, he was demonized by the West. Yes. In 86, and they bombed his compound. They killed his daughter.
And they even they blamed him with terrorist bombings of airplanes and things like that.
So he became the convenient scapegoat.
Do you think he was a terrorist in that way?
Look, I don't know. We don't really know what all the shady dealings were. The point is, as I said, that he was allied with the Soviet bloc, and he was doing things that were, that were causing some problems for the U.S. in various parts of the world. Now, that was in the 80s, but after 9/11 and after the U.S. invades Iraq in 2003, and with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Gaddafi begins looking towards the West. He invites the Italians back in. He's building up the oil sector capital, and the regime is more oppressive. And he, I don't know if the viewers know, 9/11 with the United States.
Well,
he was
saying,
being
is the U.S.
by the U.S.
We just got a minute and a half here. I just wanted to touch on, they say that there's elements of Al-Qaeda among the rebels that the U.S. are supporting. Is that true? And what does that tell us? Should we worry about that? Does that mean anything? I mean,
look, I don't think we can put much stock in the U.S. analysis of what's going on.
That was today. I was listening.
But I think in terms of closing out the interview, because people need to understand that what the U.S. is doing is no good. It is not in the interest of the people of Libya. It's not there to stop the bloodshed, to save lives. It's there to, as I said, to topple this regime, to install a more pliant regime as part of its larger geostrategic interest in advancing its control over resources in the region.
What's going to happen next?
I don't think we know exactly.
Okay, I'm going to leave it at that, so I'll give you a chance to tell us about the events.
But I am going to say that whatever happens is, with the U.S. bombing, people must oppose this, because this is not good. Nothing good could come of it. I do want to remind people again of this great event that's going to be taking place. That's April 11th, Monday at 7 p.m. at the Harlem Stage. This is on the occasion of the publication of Basics by Bob Avakian. And this is going to be a celebration of revolution and the vision of a new world. And it's going to be an exciting evening of visual arts, music, poetry, and
Thank you very much, Raymond Lotta, for joining us on Let Them Talk.
Well, thank you, Paul, for having me on. I've enjoyed it immensely.